I'm going to talk a little bit about bird origins in this video. If I can make this into a slideshow. Okay, and so the Handbook of Bird Biology goes through in chapter 2 a bit about bird origins. I like to always start with the fossil Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx was the first missing link, as they would call it, a bird that had both reptilian and bird-like features that was discovered. It was discovered in the 1860s. Using the stratigraphy of the rocks, it was dated to be about 150 years old. And so it was such a well-preserved fossil that you can actually see in this image of the fossil imprints of feathers in this fossil. And Archaeopteryx was so well preserved that you could see elements beyond just the feathers that were bird-like, and then other elements that were more reptilian. So the feathers were the first very striking, or the thing that you can notice about this Archaeopteryx fossil. You see this extension of the vertebral column here past the pelvic girdle, and all along this tail are feathers. You can also see feathers that are attached to the forelimbs of Archaeopteryx. And actually, if you look closely, you can see also something that's really compelling is that the flight feathers, the feathers on the forelimbs of Archaeopteryx, were what we call asymmetric. The central rachis, the central shaft of that feather, does not slice the vein of the feather perfectly into two halves. It's actually set off to a degree, and that's one line of evidence of flight. Birds that fly have asymmetric flight feathers. Some other interesting elements of Archaeopteryx were that the forelimbs were modified very similar in some similar ways to modern birds, but there were also some differences. And also, Archaeopteryx had a furcula. A furcula is unique to birds. It is clavicles that are fused together. When somebody eats a chicken or a turkey, you may call it the wishbone, and those are actually fused clavicles called the furcula. Archaeopteryx also had some traits that made it more similar to a reptile. For example, in the skull of Archaeopteryx, Archaeopteryx had teeth. Tooth tissue is very dense and heavy, and modern birds don't have teeth. They have bills, which are much more lightweight. But Archaeopteryx had teeth. Archaeopteryx, although it had some similarities in its wings and its forelimbs to modern birds, it wasn't exactly the same. Archaeopteryx still had digits on its forelimbs with claws. And also, Archaeopteryx had this tail that extended past the pelvic girdle, like other reptiles. And modern birds have a highly modified area there. Those vertebrae are actually fused together to form a structure called the pygostyle, where the tail feathers attach. So Archaeopteryx, 150 million years old, that gave scientists a lot of information. One is that something like modern birds was around 150 million years ago, and some of the in-between traits that gave us a snapshot of that evolutionary trajectory of birds. Here's another image of Archaeopteryx on the left, a larger image, and then slightly to the right of it is an image of a modern bird. And these are the skeletal features of Archaeopteryx in modern birds. And you can see a number of similarities and a number of differences here. And I'll just point out some of the ones that I mentioned in the previous slide. One is Archaeopteryx had teeth, and modern birds don't. They have this light bill made of keratin. Archaeopteryx had modified forelimbs that looked in many ways similar to modern birds, but it did have these clawed digits that modern birds, you don't see in modern birds. The forelimb in modern birds, especially the digits, are reduced and modified. This little structure here that's indicated by a CL, that indicates the clavicle, the furcula of Archaeopteryx, which is similar to the furcula of modern birds. But Archaeopteryx had some things, did not have certain adaptations of modern birds. For example, Archaeopteryx had a sternum, and the sternum is just where the rib bones join at the front. as do modern birds. But look at this sternum of a modern bird. When people first look at a bird's skeleton, they can hardly believe that that's the sternum, because it really extends down into what we would call the belly area. But this is the sternum. You can see the ribs attached. It's very large, and it is keeled. It looks like the keel of a boat. And that keel, that extension of the sternum, provides a lot of bone surface area for the attachment of very large pectoral muscles. Birds need large pectoral muscles to gain and maintain flapping flight. Archaeopteryx didn't have that. And so there was a lot of debate over how Archaeopteryx might have been able to fly. So those are some of the key similarities and differences. Again, you can see this caudal tail, and you saw in that previous fossil that there were feathers attached to this. And here's that modified tail in modern birds. Modern birds have this fusion of the caudal vertebrae into this structure called a pygostyle. This is an artist's rendition of what maybe Archaeopteryx looked like, fully feathered. There was a lot of debate early on about the ability of Archaeopteryx to fly. Those asymmetric flight feathers lent some strong evidence that they probably could fly, but there was some debate over whether Archaeopteryx maybe used those claws to climb trees and then glided and flapped to fly, or whether it was able to take off from the ground up. And this is an image of Archaeopteryx taking off from the ground up, and that's these newer renditions, or these renditions of Archaeopteryx running and flapping, have to do with the origins of birds. And we've learned a lot in the past 20 years or so about the origins of birds. Another fairly modern analysis that compared the anatomy of Archaeopteryx to modern birds was some cool imagery of the skull case of Archaeopteryx compared to birds. So you can look at patterns in the skull and say something about brain structures in an animal. And there was a lot of evidence in this study that suggested that Archaeopteryx had a very well-developed cerebellum. Birds have very large cerebellum. If you were to look at the brain of most mammals, including humans, they have a developed cerebellum, but a bird's cerebellum takes up a very large part of its brain. And the cerebellum is responsible for coordination, okay, in three-dimensional space. And birds, because they're moving so quickly and they're having to move themselves through a three-dimensional space, they're not stuck to the ground like most mammals. That cerebellum allows them that coordination they need to move through the space that way. And Archaeopteryx did have a developed cerebellum that also lends evidence to suggest that it could fly. So Archaeopteryx was somewhat of a reptile, somewhat of a bird. It was this missing link. And for a long time, we didn't have a lot of other evidence. There were other dinosaurs that maybe looked similar to Archaeopteryx, but the anatomy of modern birds and the anatomy of Archaeopteryx, there wasn't enough evidence to make a good conclusive link to those organisms and the group that they may have evolved from. But in the past 30 years or so, lots and lots of fossils have been found. And there's been a particularly rich area in China that has produced, rich for fossils, area that has produced lots of dinosaur fossils, including fossils of theropod dinosaurs and feathered theropod dinosaurs and ancient birds, okay? And so as more and more evidence has come in that has linked birds to things that look like Archaeopteryx and things that look something between Archaeopteryx and dinosaurs and other fossils that are more modern, we've really been able to fill in this story much more successfully. And so a little bit about this phylogeny. This tree here, this diagram that we're looking at, is called a phylogenetic tree. This is a phylogenetic tree that is using multiple types of information. So you can build trees that reflect relationships of individuals, of individual groups of animals to each other and other taxa by looking at similarities in anatomy, sometimes you use behavior, sometimes physiology is looked at, and increasingly molecular data. So the genomes of organisms are used. And as the power and the scope of genetic analysis has increased over the years, we have more and more data to overlay and reconstruct history. For fossils, dinosaurs are actually too old to get genetic data from, but we can use lots of fossil evidence to build these trees. And there are actually phylogenetic trees that use both genetic and anatomical fossil data. So this is a phylogenetic tree of vertebrates that are fully land living. Okay, so there are vertebrates that depend on water, not like whales, but vertebrates that need water to complete their life cycle, like frogs and salamanders. So these are all vertebrate tetrapods. So they have 4 limbs. These are the vertebrates that have made it from the water to the land. So they evolved from something, a type of fish. And then we have frogs and salamanders that still have this link back to the water. And then we have the tetrapods that have made that full transition to land. And that includes reptiles and mammals. It used to be reptiles, mammals, and birds, but birds are clearly nested within the larger group of organisms called reptiles. So the way to look at these phylogenetic trees, I often start by looking at them rather than from the base. I tend to start to look at them from the tips because it's easier to walk yourself back that way. And so if you look at the tips of the branches of this diagram, what you're seeing are what we call sister taxa. I'm starting down here in this bottom group, which are mammals. And so we're looking at groups of mammals and we're looking at how they're related to each other. So for example, we have Homo sapiens, those humans. And then we have Ateles peniscus. That's a type of spider monkey. And so humans are related to great apes, which are nested within the larger group of primates, which includes monkeys and lemurs and a few other animals. And so here we are as sister taxa with monkeys. Okay, and then we have some rodent-like creatures here with rats. And then we have some other groups like 2 different types of dog, which are more closely related to bears than they are to organisms like cows. Okay, and so we have these different taxa. And then the outgroup, that's not an outgroup, but the sort of more ancient, the one that was derived from the rest of the mammals longer ago was, this is a possum, which is a marsupial. So marsupials are an older family or older grouping of mammal compared to placental mammals, which are represented here, okay? And so if you start from the tips, you have the sister groups, the groups that split from each other more recently in time, and as you move back, these deeper branches are reflecting relationships deeper back in time. So if we go all the way to the base, we're going deep back in time from the time that the animals that are completely independent of an aquatic lifestyle split from things like frogs and salamanders. And actually, if you look at this very deep branch that I just sort of walked us back to from the mammals, you have mammals, and then you have this other group, which is basically everything else that's shown here. And this includes lizards, snakes, turtles, alligators, and crocodiles. They're all, and birds, they're all considered reptiles. One thing that we have in here, we have some existing taxa, like this warbler here, and we have a common raven here. We also have up at the top, iguana and gecko and a snake. We also have a turtle and crocodiles and alligators. And so if you look at these existing groups, we have these birds and then we have these other types of reptiles. You may see, if you trace your way back, that alligators and crocodiles are the existing sister group to birds, because everything between them and the birds that are here are extinct. These are extinct lineages of dinosaur. So dinosaurs were a type of reptile that evolved many millions of years ago and went extinct about 65 million years ago, when it was thought that a very large asteroid hit the Earth around our Yucatan Peninsula. So birds, the Archaeopteryx was found 150 million years ago. It was alive well into the era of dinosaurs. And so there was a lot of debate for a long time which dinosaur group birds evolved from. And it's over the past 30 years, there's just been a lot of evidence to support that birds evolved from what we call theropod dinosaurs. So theropod dinosaurs, here we go, Theropoda, starts right about at this branch, are bipedal dinosaurs that were fast moving. They were carnivorous. They ran on two hind legs. That's what bipedal means. And because of their lifestyle, probably related to their lifestyle, there was a lot of pressure from this lifestyle to have these animals that benefited animals that moved faster. And so we find, especially the smaller theropods, there's now evidence that theropods may have been warm-blooded, may have been what we call homeothermic. They could maintain a high body temperature and fuel that high body temperature by eating food. It's thought that maintenance of a warmer body temperature and feathers probably went together. And so there are a lot of theropod dinosaurs that we now have found fossils of with feathers that were not capable of flight. And then further along that evolutionary trajectory, we find evidence of flight in the evolution of birds. So here are some images of theropod dinosaurs that are probably somewhat close relatives in the same group of theropods that evolved into birds, that had ancestors that evolved into birds. Here are some dromaeosaurs, including Deinonychus, that was a fairly small, fast-moving theropod. Here is an ancient lineage of bird called Confuciusornis. So these, you can see they really do look like birds. And if you think back about Archaeopteryx and how Archaeopteryx looked, one thing I notice here with Confuciusornis is it appears they have a bill kind of like a modern bird, but you still see the maintenance of these clawed digits and a tail that consists of vertebrae that go beyond the pelvic girdle. So the tail is much more like Archaeopteryx. And then we have actually a radiation of these ancient birds that are no longer around called the Enantiornithes. And they ranged in size from about duck or goose size all the way down to sparrow size. And they also were sort of this in-between form with the clawed digits, but the presence of a bill, for example, and some modifications to the caudal vertebrae. Hesperornis is another ancient bird that had teeth in its skull. And when people look at the full skeletons, the renditions of Hesperornis, it really looks a lot like a loon. So they had legs that were set far back on their body. You can see that there's teeth here in the bill, but there's also, this tail looks much more like a modern bird. And there's a lot of strong evidence that this was a swimming bird. It could dive deep and it caught and ate fish. This one is Ichthyornis. And this one also has sharp teeth. It looks a lot like a tern. And so with all these fossils of ancient birds and modern birds and theropod dinosaurs, we've been able to start to reconstruct sort of the evolutionary history. And here is a nice phylogeny of these different groups of ancient and modern birds mapped along over millions of years, okay? And so all the way back a little bit after the time of Archaeopteryx, okay, but all the way up to 65 million years ago, to the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, where the large extinction event that led to the extinction of all other dinosaurs. And what we can see is that we have Hesperornithiformes, that was that loon-looking type of organism. Ichthyornithoformes, that was that tern-looking bird that we looked at. And then we have some of these Enantiornithoformes here. And so we see all these older forms of birds that went extinct during that extinction event. But there were some groups that were evolving before the extinction event that survived that event. And that include the paleognaths, which we'll look at. That's our oldest group of existing birds. And then the neognaths, and that's our more modern birds. But there was already starting to become a radiation of modern birds at that time, and several older lineages of modern birds survived, including the Galliformes and the Anseriformes. So Galliformes are birds like turkeys and chickens and pheasants and quail. And Anseriformes include geese and ducks and some other really interesting birds. And then we have neoaves. So all other lineages of birds evolved from the neoaves. So this is kind of an interesting story to look at, to understand distributions of birds, which we'll really talk about in another presentation. But there are these large flightless birds, paleognaths, and these are rheas in South America, ostriches in Africa, and emus in Australia. There are also cassowaries in Australia. And then in South America and Middle America, there are birds called tinamous, which are a little different. They look a little bit more like pheasants and chickens. But these large paleognaths are found on every continent, and the large ones are all flightless. So it's always been kind of a mystery, not always, but for a long time it was a mystery. How did these giant flightless birds end up on all these continents? Well, it has to do with continental drift and the timing of the evolution of these organisms, and then the timing of the drift of the continents away from each other. And so this is a reconstruction of a massive southern continent that was called Gondwana. It included South America, Africa, Madagascar, India, Antarctica, Australia, and New Zealand. And we also, I should mention kiwis and moas on New Zealand. And so that when paleognaths were evolving, that was a massive southern continent. And over time, there was continental drift. Those continents split apart into separate continents. And you find representatives from those different continents. Some are now extinct. Many are still present, all except for Antarctica. You can find that. And so it's really interesting to lay over evolutionary history with phylogenies into what we know about continental drift and changes in climate and patterns in the continents. If we look at the older group, the older lineages of what we call the neognaths, the Galliformes and the Anseriformes, they're also older lineages, but they are birds that are flighted. They can fly. And so we find radiations and we find representatives of these groups on all the major land masses. Okay, so we'll talk a bit more about bird evolution and also bird distributions in other videos.